Colleagues, let's start our afternoon session. And before we start, just some information. So, representing Latvian National Museum of Art, after our session, this afternoon session, we invite you to see museum. I hope you saw this museum before, but if you have some interest, we have three curators. One curator, Aija Brasling, is curator of our exhibition of Hennis Rosenthal's in this part of museum new hall, and if you like to see the permanent exhibition on all museums. So welcome to our museum. And now let's start with the session. For this session, we have the presentations, 3 Lithuanians and 1 Latvian. Now I would like to invite the first speaker, Linara DOVYDAITYTḵ, from the Kaunas, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Art History at the Faculty of Arts, Vytautas Malnitus University. And the presentation title is Testing New Concepts, Participatory Practices in Lithuanian Museums. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gita, for presenting, for introducing. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Christiana and Sylvia, so much. It's a big pleasure to meet the colleagues after some years. Yes, my presentation will be about museums. For the beginning, today, of course, we don't need to read once again Andreas Huysen. To learn that we live in a museum epoch. There are more and more museums in the world, and as we all know, Baltic countries are no exception. But along with the still ongoing museum growth, a museum critique is stronger than ever. Without going into details, one can say that the main target of museum critique, which dates back into the 19th century, was and still is the very nature of museum institution. Historically, the museum evolved as a colonial project, and as such mostly functions today. As anthropologist James Clifford puts it, the very structure of a museum work is colonial. The very structure of a museum work is colonial. The museum usually acts as a center which explores the periphery and collects its treasures. Museums are usually located in the metropolis and demonstrates the authority-based power to preserve and interpret objects collected in the periphery. In other words, the museum by its expert representations colonizes the images and narratives about time, for example, our past, and space, for example, surrounding world. Within the political and social context of recent century, it is important to ask, is it possible to decolonize the museum? And if so, how to do that? The ideas of decolonization of a museum were brought into life by the movement of community museums and eco-museums in France, Canada, Latin America in the 70s, and the formation of so-called museum studies discipline in the late 80s and 90s, which started to analyze the museum not from technical but from political perspective. Since then, a vast field of different concepts were proposed and tested in the museum work, and especially in the museum's communication with its audiences. Often, the shift in museums' relationship with the society is marked by the emphasis on public engagement, audience empowerment, and co-creation with non-professionals. Participation has become one of the main buzzwords in today's museum world, a term which is supposed to mean deconstruction or reshaping the colonial structure of a museum, which is normally based on hierarchy and paternalism. In my paper, I'll try to critically explore how and to what purposes the concept of participation is used in contemporary museums' agenda. What does it mean to involve audiences in museum activities? How the idea of shared authority may be implemented in producing comprehensive contents? Do participatory practices necessarily contribute to bringing out different points of views and building a space for critical discussion? In answer to these questions, I will present three forms of public involvement in museum practice in Lithuania, including co-curated projects, virtual museums, and open storage system. My examples will be taken from museums which deal with the history of 20th century, especially with its contested periods. As the latest historical and sociological research on today's Lithuanian memory reveals, memory, as we all know, has many layers, and different social groups create various, often conflicting and competing memory contents. What is the role of museum as important site of creation and transformation of memory in the process of coexistence of different memories? So the first form, co-curated projects. Museums producing co-curated projects with different social groups first of all seek to eliminate or diminish the disbalance of power between the museum as an expert authority and the audience as an ignorant learner, the museum as a decision maker and the audience as the user of these decisions. In her book on the participatory museum, Nina Simon distinguishes three levels of public participation in museum activity. In contributory projects, according to her, the museum acts as a controlling institution. The society can contribute to a limited extent by presenting objects and stories. In collaborative projects, society participates as a partner with equal rights, but the initiative belongs to the institution. In co-creative projects, groups of society create a project themselves, while the institution acts as a facilitator. The most distinct and probably unique example of co-creative museum displays in Lithuania are the museums of deportation and resistance, which were very active in the 90s. They were established by the Lithuanian Union of Political Prisoners and Deportees in dozens of Lithuanian cities and towns. The collection of these museums almost exclusively consisted of personal belongings of former deportees and resistance fighters, testifying to their life in deportation in Siberia and the guerrilla war against the Soviets in Lithuanian forests. Interestingly, the audience in these museums, they are small museums, would usually be guided by the owner of the history, as in most cases their employees are members of the union. A necessary condition for a visit is listening to the engaging stories alongside looking at the displayed objects. The performative character of these museums has at least two consequences. On the one hand, these engaging stories left only one choice for the audience, to take either the criminals or the victim's side. There were no possibilities left to question or critically reflect on the contested facts of the past, for example, the guerrilla war, which took place in the early stages of the Soviet occupation and contributed to the antagonism among different groups of Lithuanian society. On the other hand, in the 90s, these community-created and community-controlled museums performed a very important therapeutic function, both for their owners and that part of society which had suffered from Soviet terror. Unfortunately, today, these community museums are declining. The members of the union are passing away, some museums have been merged with large institutions, while the fate of others remains unclear. If we look at the museum displays of the 21st century, we can see that the level of society's participation in museum projects is rather low. Lithuanian history museums mainly carry out contributory projects, inviting the people to share their stories and objects, which are placed in the narratives created by the institution. Public involvement is quite a common tool in the museums, which function as memorial. For example, museums dealing with Holocaust often use authentic memories of witnesses and survivors in their commemorative displays. Here, personal stories told by common people are used to reinforce memorial function of these institutions and form an emotional appeal to visitors. At some degree, public participation may also be found in the agenda of museums with strong emphasis on education. Let's take the historical presidential palace in Kaunas, a museum mostly devoted to the history of Lithuania between two world wars. Established in 2005, this museum is a good exception within the context of Lithuanian museums, as it often seeks to involve people in production of its exhibitions and projects. The latest project invites people to become co-authors of a forthcoming exhibition called The Most Significant Events of the First Republic of Lithuania, which will open its doors in 2018, celebrating 100 years since the First Republic of Lithuania was established. Visitors of museum website have an opportunity to vote and select 40 events from the list of 400 facts from life, culture and politics in interwar Lithuania. But people are not allowed to propose events which they think are important. Instead of that, they are invited to upload and share photographs from family or community celebrations of the national holiday, the Day of Statehood. Here, public contributions are used to reinforce the narrative created by the institution rather than create a critical public space with different opinions and memories in counter. From the viewpoint of participation, this and other similar contributory exhibitions do not diminish the power of the museum as an expert institution, but rather increase it by providing unique and authentic material. The problem isn't that the museum decides on the final contents, but that the museum doesn't decide to involve uncertainty, provocation, and debate as necessary elements of remembering and history writing. The other forum, Virtual Museum. In this paper, I will not confuse virtual museum with museum websites or online collections. Erkki Huhtamo, in his important essay about virtual museum, relates the origins of a virtual museum with both the technical properties of the internet and the pre-digital design of the early 20th century avant-garde exhibitions. By doing this, he emphasizes the importance of activating the visitors. So, virtual museums often exist exclusively, though not necessarily, on the internet and are characterized by a decentralized, non-linear structure. Most importantly, their contents are partly or fully user-created. While referring to this concept of virtual museum, one can assert that this form of museum activity is important while speaking about the relation with the past. In the last decade, the residents of Lithuania had an opportunity to actively participate in at least several international projects related with the history of the 20th century. But let's look more closely at this example. One of the largest recent projects is the Virtual Global Museum on Communism, launched in 2009. The project was initiated by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation based in Washington with the purpose to commemorate the deaths of the victims of communism and resistance struggles. The Lithuanian government also gave financial support to this global project. The museum contains historical material on important events and personalities, and the victims of communism and members of their families can register on the museum website and share information. In Lithuania, this project was bitterly criticized by the movement of the New Left and anarchists, which accused the museum of presenting an oversimplified black and white version of history and demonizing the very idea of communism. Their approach has not been limited to criticism. The members of this movement created a new virtual global museum on capitalism, which was built on the principle of parody. The terrors of communism were replaced with the terrors of capitalism, and thus the one-sided representation of the past was mocked. Although this story of two oppositional museums did not receive a wide public response, it illustrates the possibilities opened by a virtual museum. The phenomenon of a virtual museum allows us not only to criticize the contested versions of history, but also to perform productive actions. to produce, to multiply, to promote alternative versions reflecting the views of different communities. And the third form, open storage system, a radical form of breaking the hierarchy of colonial museum is an open storage system. The museum's authority is mainly based on the fact that the physical structure of the museum consists of two unequal parts, huge storages which are invisible, and displays, exhibitions staged by museum curators, which allow a glimpse of a tiny part of these storages. Making collections available for society not only opens the possibility for a wider circle of people to get acquainted with the hidden collections, but also can transfer the role of the curator from the museum to its visitors or users. Implementations of the idea of open storage system is in progress in Lithuanian museums. A major step is the project of digitization and promotion of museum objects called LIMIS, which was put into life by the Lithuanian Art Museum from 2010 until 2013. During the project, an integral information system was built and installed in largest museums of Lithuania with a possibility for other museums to join. The project executors so far have stressed that the system can modernize and facilitate the work of professionals and of museum employees. This is registering, systematization and processing of exhibits, data preservation and copying. But another, no less important part of the project is the availability of objects for public viewing. The users of this portal can find the data on exhibits, information, additional information on museums, order an image of an exhibit and book a visit to a museum. Registered users have a possibility to create their own collection. Typical steps with this open storage system online. However, important legal issues of public use have not been solved yet. How and for what purposes the digital images of museum objects can be used. The project executors are very much concerned about the development of the project. However, it is important to make public use an equally important task in the future. The sharing of museum objects can encourage creating different narratives about the past, which would meet the memory demands of different groups of society. And conclusions. So what are the meanings of society participation in a museum activity? This short overview revealed that the residents of Lithuania have and use the possibility to take part in creating museum narratives about their history. Different museum narratives reflecting the memory of various groups of society most often appears when the initiatives come from interest groups from below. This is how community museums or alternative virtual museums are born. However, participatory practices do not necessarily contribute to bringing out different views of the past, and a space for critical discussion is not always built. Museums can successfully appropriate different testimonies and narratives to consolidate their own authority-based narrative. So the concept of participation is not as clear as it might seem at first sight. A vast literature about participation in museum can be divided into two camps. Such authors as earlier mentioned Nina Simon shares enthusiasm about the very concept of participation as inherently democratic. Other authors, such as Stuart Birch, are more skeptical. According to him, rarely museums implement fully participatory projects. When participation of audiences is somehow limited, or the final decisions are taken by the museum, we can speak only about partial participation or even pseudo-participation. As Birch put it, participation always is a matter of degree. I would argue that participation is a matter of purpose. Participatory practices is not only a trendy tool to communicate with museum publics, but first of all, a challenge to the traditional colonial notion of museum. In his theory, James Clifford has proposed to call colonial museum a contact zone, or a space of contention and negotiation where different interests encounter. Clifford argues that a productive understanding of the museum as a contact zone appears when the museum realizes its own contradictory colonial nature and begins mutual interaction, with different social groups and communities instead of merely educating or improving the audience. So we may say that a necessary element of participatory museum is self-reflection, or how the museum understands its nature, as negative or productive if it denies its inherent contradictions or is open to dispute and negotiations. Thank you for your attention.